Thank you so much, Anzi. Thank you so much to Mark Tooley and Colin Bastian and George and the whole team here at IRD for your hospitality. Thanks, everyone, for turning out to this event. We're really excited to see how full of a room we have here. Sorry to all of you guys who can be standing, but I think that that says something about the vigor of Protestantism in public life here in D.C. So we're very excited to be part of that at the Davenant Institute, resourcing Protestants for thinking critically and in a historically grounded way about how to be good citizens and faithful Christians in a society where those are no longer the same thing. Now, the title of this book, of course, is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek in the sense that we all hear a lot, most of us at least have heard of Catholic social teaching. Nobody probably to date has heard of Protestant social teaching. And arguably, you could argue the title is a misnomer because the Protestants do not have a single teaching office the way the Roman Catholic Church is. We do not have a magisterium. We don't have one source, one living source to whom you can go and say, what is Protestant social teaching? But of course, in practice, just because Catholics have the Pope does not mean that they all agree on what Catholic social teaching is. Far from it. And we would like to argue that there is a coherent tradition of Protestant social thought, Protestant social reflection on what the Scriptures and what reason and what church history have to say about the role of the citizen. There is a coherent tradition to be recovered, and it's the task of this book to recover it. And we think that this is particularly important because America was founded very much as a Protestant nation, right? Thank you. Amen. So, of course, there were a couple of Catholics there at the founding. There was tolerance for Roman Catholics, but there's no question that the DNA of this country, the political DNA, the institutions, the laws, were anchored in a Protestant in Protestant social imaginary and Protestant assumptions about the nature of government and the role of the Christian citizen. And that continues to inform and shape the structures of American society, and it certainly continues to be the case in even though Catholicism is, of course, far more vibrant in America now than it was at the time of the founding. Still, religion in America is far and away disproportionately Protestant. In fact, Roman Catholicism in America, as I like to say, is really, Protestantism with the Pope, Protestants who like Mary. Okay, Roman Catholicism in America has been deeply, deeply shaped by its Protestant context and is not the same thing as Roman Catholicism was in the Old World. So if there is to be a retrieval and renewal of what the American experiment was intended to achieve, that renewal is going to have to depend upon a renewal of a politically engaged, historically rooted Protestantism. Catholics are very dominant in the conservative movement and conservative think tanks. We're very grateful for all the work that they are doing, trying to plug the holes in the sinking ship. But ultimately, the ship that they're trying to plug holes in is a Protestant ship, and Protestants need to get their act together if this country is going to have a future. So, this book is an attempt to contribute to that by digging into our heritage and drawing on the Scriptures, drawing on the work of church fathers and medievals as Protestants. Although Scriptures are highest norm, that doesn't mean that Protestants ignore the contributions of the first 15 centuries of church history. Far from it. And this volume, I think you'll see engagement with key thinkers throughout the first 15 centuries of the church's history, but also centrally an engagement with the work of the magisterial reformers in the 16th century and their heirs in the 17th century, and then bits and pieces of some Protestant thinkers on down to the present day, as well as some constructive work, thinking about what does a Protestant social ethic look like today under new modern conditions. So I think this book is really, you'll find it very diverse in its sources, anchored in the Scriptures, anchored in the Reformation, but with an appropriate Protestant eclecticism drawing the best of wisdom throughout church history. Now, my own chapter is titled The Civil Magistrate, which is, of course, a central part of any social theory is going to have to understand what is the role of government and how should Christians relate to government. And I just want to highlight a few themes in my chapter that I think particularly speak to the needs of the present moment. So I kick off my discussion with this quote from John Calvin. It says, "No one ought to doubt that civil authority is a calling not only holy and lawful before God, but the most sacred and by far the most honorable of all callings in the whole life of mortal men." Now, this is a very jarring statement, I think, to many modern Americans and many conservatives in particular. We've kind of grown up on slogans like that government is best, which governs least. The government is the problem, not the solution. Grover Norquist saying his goal was to shrink government to where it could be drowned in a bathtub, right? So government is bad. That's what we as Americans and conservatives think. And yet the reformers had these very, very positive things to say about the role of government, the role of civil authority in human life. And I think, in part, that's a result of we take the blessings of government so much for granted. We're the beneficiaries of centuries and centuries of relatively stable, peaceful, free governments in the way that the reformers were not. The reformers knew that society was always just a couple steps away from descending into chaos. And it's easy for us to just look around and think that, peace and harmony and the free market and all that stuff, just happens. And the problem with government's just getting in the way. When in fact, many of these things that we enjoy are the result of good government over a long period of time. And if we take that for granted and we forget the difference between good government and bad government, many of these things that we depend on are no longer going to be there. So the reformers emphasize government as a God-given gift. And I think this is an important thing to recover this this moment in politics when there's a lot of talk about the realignment on the right and a new right and post-liberalism and these ideas among conservatives realizing that it's not enough anymore to just talk about government as the problem, getting government out of the way, that we actually have to step up and have a positive vision of the role of government in creating the conditions necessary for the pursuit of the common good. And I think in this moment when conservatives are rediscovering that, which used to be common knowledge, I think the work of the Protestant reformers is extremely valuable because these were theologians who were called upon to advise statesmen, who are constantly engaged with the business of politics and needing to think about how the scriptures, how natural law, how the needs of the church related to the task of politics. So this is the first thing I would say. The first thing is to say the reformers understood the importance of civil authority for creating conditions necessary for the pursuit of the common good in a way that contemporary conservatives have somewhat lost sight of. Now, the second thing to note is when we hear that quote from Calvin, I give a number of other quotes where the reformers seem to say these kind of ridiculously over-the-top positive things about the rulers in their day. You're like, well, what's wrong with you sycophants? Don't you know that? I mean, do you really believe this? Are you just bootlickers, or are you that naive to think that rulers are that just? Well, no, they're not. Luther, who has very positive things to say about civil government, also says, a wise prince is a mighty rare bird. Let's see if I have the quote. A wise prince is a mighty rare bird, and an upright prince even rarer. They are generally the biggest fools or the worst scoundrels on earth. Therefore, one must constantly expect the worst from them and look for little good. Okay? So Luther could be very, very pessimistic. But how did they hold these things together? Well, they held it together by distinguishing between the person and the office in a way that I think is really important for us to recover in modern American life, because we live in a time in which, of course, the personal is political, and in which political leaders have for decades now, but increasingly are functioning as celebrities and are trying to imitate the way in which celebrities are supposed to present themselves and supposed to influence people. And so we look to our political leaders as for their personality. We look for them. How good do they look on TV? How friendly do they seem? Or how tough guy do they seem? Depending on what personality type you like, you try to gravitate toward a political leader who embodies that. And we saw this with Obama and Trump, both in their own different ways, really turned the presidential office into sort of a referendum on what you thought of them as a person. And of course, this is very problematic because people, as Luther shows, people always fail us. All of the individual persons who are occupying political office are likely to be scoundrels, and they're likely to let us down in a very big way. And if our idea of political authority is simply invested in this person or this personality, that's going to lead to a kind of an unbalanced approach, where we either sort of idolize the person or we get disillusioned by them, and then we have contempt for the person. And if we idolize the person, we also idolize the office. And if we have contempt for the person, we have contempt for the office. And what the Reformers tried to emphasize is there's a God-given office which has an intrinsic authority that needs to be respected and preserved, however bad the person occupying that office is. And in fact, the way in which you hold bad leaders accountable is by constantly pointing back to the sanctity of the office that they hold. And I think it's very important. It's easy for us to get drawn into this personalization of politics that we see around us. But I think it's very important for us as Christians and conservatives to recover this reformational understanding of the distinction between person and office. Two other points I'll make really quick. Again, as I said, conservatives have for a few decades kind of outsourced a lot of their thinking to libertarians. It seemed like we could make common cause with libertarians against a common foe, and so we just kind of let libertarians do most of the theorizing for us, not realizing that ultimately it's a very different vision of the human person and the nature of political community. So I think that as conservatives are rediscovering an authentically conservative understanding of the positive role of government in pursuing the common good, again, the Reformers are a great resource for us. In my chapter, I talk about the example of Martin Bucer, who wrote a treatise, De Regno Christi, on the Kingdom of Christ, that was basically a advice to young Edward VI, King of England, saying, here's all the policies that you should implement. And it's great, because it's like he runs the gamut from like, here's what you need to do to train better theologians and preachers, to here's what you need to do to maximize wool production in England's sheep regions, right? But it's interesting. He ties it together. The bit about wool production, or actually, sorry, I should go back. He doesn't want to maximize wool production. That's what's going on. Is there is an attempt to maximize wool production, and he's saying this is a problem because we're turning over all of this farmland that could be used to feed people, and could be used to employ laborers, and we're turning it over to sheep pasture, which doesn't require many laborers and doesn't produce food. And so there was a massive unemployment problem and a massive food shortage problem. But the landowners were getting very rich off of the wool exports. And Bucer says, no, we need to understand that the purpose of an economy is the purpose of an economy is human flourishing. The purpose of an economy is to provide good jobs and sustenance for the citizens of the country, so that, and it's tied in with a spiritual good, he says, so that there may be as many good men everywhere who call on the name of the Lord. So basically, Bucer's theory is, our end goal is we want as many people in the kingdom of heaven as possible. Okay, so that requires evangelism and preaching and so on. But it also means we need to have a lot of people to start with, right? I mean, you want to maximize the population on earth as a prerequisite to maximize the population on heaven. If you want to maximize the population on earth, you need good agricultural and industrial policy to make sure people have good jobs and can raise lots of kids. Right? So a kind of integrated Christian conservative theory of the common good. So finally, I think what we are seeing at this cultural moment is that it is there are things that we sort of imagined for a while that it was possible to have a naked public square, to have a just totally religiously neutral public square. But the only reason it was possible to imagine that was because our public square was in fact still haunted by the ghost of Christianity. It looked like an empty, naked public square, but in fact, Christianity was still a force creating the expectations and the norms within which our laws and public institutions operated. And as that is increasingly giving way to what I think Joshua Mitchell has sort of rightly diagnosed as a kind of heretical, but sort of a heretical mutation of evangelical religion, which is the kind of religion of wokeness. What we're seeing is a new religiosity taking hold of our public institutions, and a religiosity that is increasingly hostile to the culture that has been formed historically by the Christian religion. So it's no longer enough, we cannot just kind of nod toward generally agreed upon liberal norms of neutrality and civility. We actually have to have a substantive vision of the human good grounded upon an understanding of what it means for humans to be created in the image of God and to be under the kingship of Christ. And that does not mean reestablishing a theocracy. It doesn't mean that we need to go back to the kind of church establishments, the very close relationship of church and state that you saw in the Protestant Reformation. But it does mean that we need to think seriously about the religious preconditions for a just society, and understand that, in fact, a just society has to be ordered toward, as Augustine said, how could there be justice? If justice is giving to everyone his due, how can there be justice in a society that's not giving God his due? And the Reformers thought very seriously about how that relationship is supposed to work. How can a society be ordered toward the highest good in a way that still allows, that is not in this sort of top-down way that was achieved by the medieval papacy, where you have a supreme earthly guardian trying to sort of make sure that every society is ordered toward the highest good. The Reformers rejected that. They wanted a more bottom-up arrangement. They wanted freedom within each society to figure out what the institutions should look like within that society to integrate the temporal and the spiritual good. But they still understood those two were tightly integrated. And I think that wisdom is urgently needed for us today. So I cover all those bases briefly in my chapter. And if you're interested in those themes, I'd also particularly commend to you our book that we published last year called A Protestant Christendom, which we've got on the book table over there. So I've probably gone over my time, so I'm going to hand it off to Mark.